What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 183. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. A lot to talk about today, including the Biden administration moving away from diplomacy with Iran, talking about updates on what's happening in Afghanistan, and news on Guantanamo Bay detainees testifying about the torture. So, a lot going on today's show. Be sure to share the show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute. And right now, at the Libertarian Institute, we have our fall fund drive going on, well over halfway towards meeting our goal. So, you can help us get there by making a donation today. We still have matching funds going on right now. So, if you donate $100, that will be matched and becomes a $200 donation. There's kickbacks for donations, and of course, you're supporting the work of myself, Scott Horton, Sheldon Richmond, Pete Quinones, and a great slate of writers and podcast hosts, including Connor Freeman, Hunter DeRenis, Pete writes. It's absolutely great. So be sure to check out the Institute and make a donation today. Other things you could do to help the show is just by sharing the show. You find it, other than the Institute, at YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee for the video version. We have social media accounts: Facebook, MeWe, and Twitter. And then you can also support the show if you just want to give individually to us at Patreon, Subscribestar, or you can find the crypto information in the show notes page. The sponsor of the show is Paloma Verde. By getting your CBD products at Paloma Verde, you are helping the show. And so when you go to palomaverdecbd.com and use the promo code PEACE, you get a discount. The show gets a kickback. And by the way, they're the best CBD products you could buy. The lab tested results are right there on the website. They mix their CBD with things like curcumin and melatonin to enhance the benefits that you could get. Their sports cream has a great menthol smell, and I really love it. It works great. It works for a long time. So no matter what you got going on, there may be something that could help you at palomaverdecbd.com. Just be sure to use the promo code PEACE when you check out. Help the show, help yourself. All right, now let's get into it. The first story we have is Guantanamo Bay detainee Mehdi Khan was able to testify in court for about 2 hours about the torture that he suffered. And so, just to get into a little bit of who Mehdi Khan is, he was, I guess, has been in Guantanamo Bay since 2006, but before that, since I believe like February 2002, when he actually confessed to being involved in an Al-Qaeda plot. He has been, transferred and sent around U.S. black sites for several years. So, Khan grew up until he was 16 in Pakistan and then moved to Maryland and was, I think, working, in the United States for some time before he ends up in Guantanamo Bay. Anyways, now he's 41 years old. He has undergone quite a significant amount of torture, and he talks about some of the worst things, and it's in this article by Spencer Ackerman, where he was waterboarded, put in ice baths, and then it seems like he was waterboarded in other ways where it wasn't necessarily on the decline board. It was essentially just they drowned him until they thought he was about to die, and then they would resuscitate him. He was put in all kinds of stress positions and then left in solitary for quite an extended period of time, which is also a form of torture. But maybe the more unique thing, because people do know about the waterboarding and the stress positions, and not that I want to just glance over it, but I've talked about the torture program a lot, and it's absolutely horrible. But one of the things that he highlights is the use of sexual abuse against the detainees, and this is just another level of horror that went on here, where you had, he says it was the medics. One of them actually grabbed his genitalia, which is absolutely disgusting. I don't know why you would do that. But he also says that himself, and I believe he also says other detainees, were force fed anally rather than the more standard practice, I guess, of doing it like through the nose, even though that's pretty horrific. So they were unnecessarily, under the guise of maybe a medical experiment, shoving things up his ass. And that is, you know, sexual abuse and rape. And these are the horrors that you hear that go on in prisons in places like Mexico or Libya. But here it was, happening, I guess, in Cuba, but in the United States torture prison, or actually around the world. They sent him to different blood sites all over the place. I don't think he actually knew what country he was in a good amount of the time. So, all the torture, he says that he basically just started saying things, whatever they wanted to hear. He signed a confession in late August of 2003, it says, and then he was kind of left alone after that. He doesn't even know what the confession says. Now, he is somebody who has, I guess, confessed to his crime pretty early on in February of '02, and then that was not involvement in 9/11. It was a tad somewhere in Southeast Asia, maybe Bangladesh, where he helped curry money that was somehow used in a bombing plot that did leave quite a few people dead. And so, he's now done a lot of time. He also pled guilty in an American court to this, and I'll talk a little bit about the sentence that he received coming up. But another thing that's important to note, in 2012, he started testifying against other members of Al-Qaeda, including the main conspirators of 9/11, including Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, KSM. And so, this is a guy where, while he was tortured, he was willing to say what he knew without it. The torture produced absolutely nothing. But also now, as Americans, something that we have to consider is that there are people in our country that were involved in this torture program who are not held accountable, who are not marked as people who will, torture you, unnecessarily, anally violate you. And that is very, very concerning. And, it's not just me, an anti-war guy, that says this, but actually the military jury at his trial said essentially the same thing. So this was a military trial. The jury was made up of, I believe, 8 military officers. Of course, he was had pled guilty, so they're more deciding on his sentence. I think they picked either the minimum or near the minimum sentence possible, 26 years. However, it seems unlikely that he would serve that whole term, as there's an urging of clemency for not only, I guess, the torture that he went through, the fact that he's admitted to it and has tried to, I guess, be more of a reformed prisoner type person, and also he was testifying against the other members of Al-Qaeda. Kind of shows that you're still not loyal to that group and all that kind of stuff. So along with picking a minimum sentence, 7 of the 8 members of the jury, again these are military officers, handwrote and signed a letter, which I guess is a prerogative of a military jury to do, that condemned the torture that Mr. Khan faced. And so again, while a lot of people are like, oh well, you just like the terrorist or something like that, I've gotten plenty of that kind of "you just hate America" rhetoric in the past. That's obviously not what is going on here, when even the military officers are horrified by what the U.S. government did. Now, along with this testimony, which I guess is the first kind of public court testimony that we've had from a torture survivor, although I do think there's been a couple of people who have been released and who have been interviewed and spoken about their experience otherwise, but we also have Abu Zubaydah, who may be able to testify actually in a Polish court about his CIA torture, and that is because the different blood sites that I guess Zubaydah and other of these detainees were moved to and from. One included being in Poland, and they actually care there a little bit, I guess, about justice when people are being tortured, waterboarded, as Abu Zubaydah was. And they're real upset about this. Now, one of the really nasty things I found out recently about Abu Zubaydah, and this was actually in a John Kiriakou article, I believe he published it at Consortium News, where he outlines that Abu Zubaydah, I guess, had like an eye that really wasn't a functional eye anymore. But nonetheless, like it was his eye, and the U.S. government just went in and cut it out without his express medical permission to do so. And so, removing body parts from somebody without their medical consent is a horrific level of torture. So one of the interesting things I think about the Abu Zubaydah testimony, or about the trial that he's trying to line up, is he is trying to get the psychologists James Mitchell and Bruce Jessen to actually have to testify at that, which would be interesting because these are the most horrific people that you could imagine. People who are trained in the field of psychology, meant to heal people's minds. What they were actually trying to do is figure out the recipe for breaking and destroying human minds, and they were paid tens of millions, I think like $80 million by the U.S. government to do this. And, of course, they remain free men. And I mean, I would sleep much better at night knowing that they were behind bars for the rest of their lives. These insane torturers, these are the kind of people that, like, in cartoons, are represented by like a German doctor who has like an evil cackle laugh and is talking about, we're going to remove an arm here and a finger there and, rip out your toenails and stuff like that is the kind of level of horror that these people are operating on. Now, they are more concerned about psychological torture, like people putting afraid of buds and coffins with them, but also a lot of physical stuff, beating prisoners, of course, the sexual abuse and everything like that. And this was, this is the torture program. Now, the thing that's been going on, and it went to actually the Supreme Court with Abu Zubaydah's testimony, is I believe the country of Poland is actually pushing to let the United States do this. And so I think it kind of looked like the Supreme Court was actually going to let him testify. And what the DOJ is now offering is that they are going to let Zubaydah testify, but they're going to redact whatever they want of his testimony. And this seems like just a way to appease the Supreme Court without actually letting new information about the torture program out through Abu Zubaydah's testimony. One last story on Gitmo detainees, former ones. The UAE has released 12 former Guantanamo Bay detainees into Yemen. It sounds like these people have essentially served out whatever sentence that they were alleged to have owed, even though they, weren't convicted in any kind of trial or anything like that. But you can't hold people forever just because the U.S. alleges that they were involved in al-Qaeda or whatever. I'm not sure who these people are. I think they're picked up in Afghanistan or Pakistan. I'm not sure even if they're all Yemeni nationals or not. There's not a whole lot of details I could find, but just saying that were part of a group of 18 Yemenis and one Russian. So I guess they were Yemenis who were transferred from Guantanamo Bay between 2015 and 2017. And anyways, now that they have been released to Yemen, I guess my concern is that this is maybe something that the conservatives, the Republicans, try to prey upon to say, especially Yemen is a state right now where at war all over the place, right? And so if they become in any way involved in that fight, then of course they're going to say, see, you can't release these people ever. And also it's interesting just because of who the UAE has backed, including AQAP in Yemen, if this is possibly them like trying to send in some fighters. I'm not exactly sure what's going on here, but I think it's kind of an interesting story that I would like to follow up on, and I could see getting some major media attention if any of these people do return to the battlefield. All right, now some news on Afghanistan, where I gotta say, it's been harder to nail down exactly what's going on there since the U.S. has pulled out. There have been some big and major claims about, how cruel the Taliban have been, so I'm gonna try to get into that. And Scott Horton recently, in the past couple of weeks, interviewed Andrew Quilty, who is actually still on the ground in Kabul, and so I think he gives a pretty interesting take. But I read this story by CNN, and I've also seen it in BBC and a couple other outlets now, about Afghan families selling, particularly it seems, their young daughters into essentially slavery or child marriages in order to feed the rest of their families. Now, I gotta say, I'm kind of skeptical of the reporting here, just because the CNN story, they're saying, they're selling this girl as the second girl in the family that they've sold already this year, and that she's basically going to be a servant at another family, and that was like $2,000 or something, where you would think if the CNN knew about this, that they could maybe get that family $2,000 to prevent this sale from happening or something. There's just some questionable things going on with those stories. However, the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan is very, very bad right now. I've heard a couple of problems. One, they say that there's a currency crisis where there's not enough money to go around, and so people can't buy anything. Now, I guess that in a sense doesn't make sense to me, because if no, I could buy anything, it's not like the farmers are going to let the food expire. It'll eventually like start to come down to and maybe just market forces take a little bit of time to work for that to actually happen, or it's that all the money in Afghanistan was like kind of consolidated and stolen over the past 20 years, and so now that the people who were just like kind of subsistent level, which was most of Afghans who really just whatever aid package that they were getting from the people at the refugee camp that they were living in, or whatever kind of cash payment maybe system that they were getting from the Afghan government, all that stuff is now gone. And so all these people who are essentially living day to day, week to week, month to month, or whatever, on welfare, they no longer have money. And so I'm not exactly sure if it's more that where I don't know, that just to say that there's enough currency doesn't sound exactly right to me. From a libertarian standpoint, it sounds like there's not enough money for the people who are really desperate and need it. And then also, with all the foreign aid drying up in Afghanistan, there's a lot of jobs that now don't have funding, civil service jobs. I haven't really heard trash collectors, but I would guess stuff like that is probably being left undone, because whatever foreign country that was pouring in the aid for that is no longer doing so. But definitely I've heard like teachers and nurses and stuff like that, all this was coming from foreign international funding before, and so now that that's all that money has dried up, those people are going without being paid. And so it seems like there is quite a bit of suffering going on in Afghanistan. And of course, it is about to enter winter in Afghanistan, which it is a harsher time of year to try to survive, especially for these people in refugee camps and everything like that. And so I mean, it's kind of all being blamed on the Taliban, which I don't think makes a lot of sense. The Western countries poured millions of billions, hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars into Afghanistan over the past 20 years. And if the system that they set up was so fragile that was able to fall apart in a month, and now just 2 months later the people are already starving to death, well then the system that was set up was just completely fragile and unsustainable. However, I think it's a lot more than that, because the US government has responded by freezing the Afghan government assets, and also with the sanctions on Afghanistan, makes it a lot harder to get aid in. Even if they say there are exceptions for aid and all that, we've talked about this in Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, Syria, Cuba, what have you. All these countries, even though they say, oh, we make exceptions for medicine and food and all that stuff, the exceptions really don't work. The international money community doesn't want to do business with countries like Afghanistan, who are ruled by the Taliban, like the Iranian government and stuff like that. And so they can't bring in medications, and also they label everything vaguely dual use, and so you can't get into Afghanistan with batteries or masks or something like that, because they could potentially be used for some kind of military purpose or operations. So there's a lot of problems, right, with the way the U.S. is doing this, and the harm it's inflicted on the Afghans by doing so. However, the Taliban aren't completely blameless here. In that Quilty interview with Scott Horton, he points out that despite the Taliban promises, it definitely hasn't come to fruition, that women haven't been quite as elevated as they said they were as they were coming to power, that minority groups haven't been quite as elevated since the Taliban came to power. That being said, he says there's like not a systematic targeting of former like Afghan government employees or officials or anything like that, although several have been targeted and assassinated. Although, as he kind of acknowledges in this interview, it could be like almost grievances, right? Like this has been a 20-year long war, and so Afghan commandos that were backed by the CIA or even the Pentagon, carried out some horrific crimes during the past 20 years. And if somebody is looking for reprisal for their son, daughter, family being killed, something like that, well, those kind of things do happen a little bit. And since the Taliban essentially won the war, that side's going to be the one that's carrying out the kind of reprisals. And so I'm not sure if it's that, or maybe in some places in Afghanistan, the central Taliban have a little bit less control, and so local commanders just are kind of taking out people who they want to take out. Let's see, anything else? Oh, one thing he did mention, and I have seen in other articles as well, is while a lot of the girls' schools haven't opened in Afghanistan, and while that is at least in part due to the Taliban rules and restrictions, it also is in part to just the shortage of teachers due to a lack of funding. One of the things that is very unfortunate about the way the Taliban have carried out their census policies and all that with trying to segregate schools and everything like that. Well, if you had 20 students in the 6th grade class, 10 boys, 10 girls before, and that's one teacher, now you have 10 boys in one class and 10 girls in another class. Well, now you need 2 teachers. And the way the Taliban work, and this is very unfortunate, that the boys are going to be the ones that get the instruction and not the girls, I'm guessing, in almost all those cases. And so that would be a reason for like the US to allow in more aid to Afghanistan, because some of it is going to get to teachers, put people to work, get people to the point where at least it's not able to be reported by CNN, even if it's untrue, that people are selling their daughters into slavery and crazy stuff like this. Let's see, anything else on Afghan? Well, I got a bunch of other stuff on Afghanistan. So let's talk about the USA to Afghanistan, kind of looking back. Well, I just got this real quick. The Taliban are once again calling for the U.S. to release the billions in frozen assets, saying that currency would really help them to stop people from starving. Of course, I'm sure they're going to use some of the money on anti-ISIS operations and other stuff like that, for their own military, for their own corruption and cronyism and all that kind of stuff that every government, including the Taliban government, will do. Some of it will probably get into the hands of the people, at least if the money is released and then the Afghan people are suffering, they're more likely to blame the Taliban, whereas now the Taliban have a pretty good scapegoat in the U.S. because we're freezing all the money. But there's a story here from Roll Call titled U.S. Rarely Enforced Conditions on Afghan Aid Audit, says, and this is an audit looking at a bunch of the military aid that the U.S. gave to the Afghan National Army, and found that even though they conditioned the money, saying that, look, you got me standard A, B, C, and D, provide receipts for all this, show us where the money is going, show us where these troops are, prove they're not ghost soldiers and all that, that this often didn't happen, and they just ignored their own conditions. And it says U.S. officials lost considerable control over spending that totaled nearly $89 billion. And so if you're now the Americans 2 months after you left and realize that $89 billion in a country where they're alleging that children are being sold for $2,000, but nonetheless, even if that's not happening, in a country where just a few $1,000s is an absolutely life-changing amount of money, the fact that we just gave away billions of dollars, including a lot of the money going to the Taliban in the form of either bribes or essentially hiring Taliban workers to carry out different activities, building projects, and all that's happened. happen over the past 20 years. It's just completely ridiculous for the American people to now, think that all the suffering happening in Afghanistan is because of the Taliban. We also had some interesting things happening with the State Department and reports of the aid. And this comes from the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction. That office is run by John Sopko, and they say that after and as the Afghan government was falling, they had a request from the State Department to remove all of the audit, inspection, and financial audit reports from the Cigar website. And it said that it needed to remove that to protect its Afghan allies. And he said that, initially the office did comply with this request because, you say that people are in danger, then we'll take it down. But then they asked for and they write or he says, but despite repeated requests, state was never able to describe any specific threats to individuals that were supposedly contained in our reports, nor did state ever explain how removing our reports now could possibly protect anyone, since many were years old and extensively disseminated worldwide. And so he says, look, these reports are out here, they're public information, and the State Department can't even pull that back. And so this is concerning. And it seems like trying to take down this information at a time where having this easy access to will be beneficial for reporters trying to figure out what the hell happened in Afghanistan, how it went so poorly so quickly, and they were clearly trying to hide that information. And it seems like maybe it's a coordinated thing happening in the Biden administration, as we have the Pentagon quietly removing, and this is from Task and Purpose, the Pentagon quietly removed more than 130,000 Afghan war photos and videos from public view. One of the pictures is actually on the screen now for people who aren't watching. Looks like 3 American soldiers sleeping with a dog, and one of the soldiers has on a Washington Redskins blanket. And no photo picture face of anyone or anything that could possibly be identifiable as anything. And this picture, along with 120,000 other photos and 17,000 videos, were removed from the website, saying that it has to go through and look at all that to see if it's actually able to be disseminated to the American people, even though that this has been in public view for a long time. And so, you wonder if it's already been in public view, if the decision to take it down now is more about depriving the public of this potential information, just like, removing the financial reports, rather than about concern for anybody's safety, especially since one of the pictures that we see clearly couldn't be used to identify or target anyone. All right, let's move on to some things that happening in Afghanistan. Just a week or so ago, we had a Taliban raid in the city of Herat, where there was an allegation, I guess, of some ISIS-K kidnappers hanging out. The Taliban claim, I think they killed 4 of the kidnappers, and the reports say that 10 civilians were among the 16 dead. 8 homes were destroyed. And so, one of the things here is that the Taliban do have collateral damage in their anti-ISIS operations, just like the United States does. One thing, if it's carried out by the Taliban, the blowback, is directed within Afghanistan. Also, the Taliban are probably going to be less likely to, just be fooled and kill the wrong people like the Americans were so many times during the past 20 years. But also, another thing to point out and realize here, that it is the Taliban who are more than willing to engage in operations against the Islamic State. We had this here from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. He writes, the Wall Street Journal reported Sunday that some former members of the now defunct U.S.-backed Afghan government's intelligence and military forces have joined the local ISIS affiliate known as ISIS-K. The journal cited people who knew several men who joined up with ISIS-K after the U.S. withdrawal. The report says the number of defectors who joined ISIS-K is relatively small but continues to grow. Very interesting here how the Taliban are like the mortal enemies of the ISIS-K, and they oppose them no matter if they're if the Americans are there or not. But when the American government leaves, a bunch of our former allies, or not a bunch, but at least some of our former allies go and enlist with ISIS-K. One last thing going on in Afghanistan that I wanted to cover, and that is 25 people today were killed in an attack on a hospital in Kabul. It was apparently a military hospital. 50 more people were wounded. It's exactly unclear at this point who carried out the attack, but it has ISIS-K written all over it. 5 attackers, 2 suicide bombers, 3 gunmen. I guess one of the gunmen was captured by Taliban security. Not exactly sure if this military hospital had any civilian uses at all. Maybe with the desperate state right now in Afghanistan, maybe with like the change in who controls Afghanistan, they're treating civilian patients too. And I have to imagine that any hospital capacity to being taken out in Kabul right now could have some pretty serious long-term consequences. All right, now I want to move on and talk about some news with Iran. The first thing I want to go over, and this is from I think a week ago, and that is Iran said they're willing to hold direct talks with European parties on the nuclear deal, and it sounds like this is a signal that Iran is ready to return to the talks in Vienna. Of course, those have always been indirect talks with the United States because Trump unilaterally withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, and that, you know, one of the conditions that the Iranians had set out initially was, we're not even going to talk to the Americans until they come back into compliance with the deal and the sanctions are removed. But now they are at the point where they're saying, or have been for the Biden administration, willing to talk to the Americans on this indirect basis in Vienna. Now, one thing that we covered on last week's show with Connor Freeman was that Trita Parsi had done some pretty important reporting showing that the Biden administration had no interest from the start in returning to this deal. The Iranians under Rouhani offered a really golden offer to the Biden administration, just asking them to remain within a guarantee that they would remain within the JCPOA for the remainder of Biden's presidency, 3 years, not even trying to extend that guarantee to the next president, whether it be a Democrat or not. And that was even rejected by the Biden administration. So it just goes to show it doesn't seem like they were ever very interested in carrying out any actual negotiations with the Iranians and returning to this deal. So we had those talks, and then the U.S. also talked with its European allies and said that its allies were in lockstep together on this. And so I'm not sure what that means. The Iranians seem to take it as a positive. They say they welcome the calls from the U.S. European allies, UK, France, and Germany, to return to talks between the indirect talks in Vienna. And so, it seemed like probably, up until a few days ago that maybe things were going okay. But then we got reports saying that the U.S. was highly skeptical that the Iranians were serious and was considering harsher action than it was currently going with the diplomatic and sanctions route. And then probably the most important news we have, and this was at the end of last week after, the Iranians are talking about returning to talks with the Americans in November, the U.S. hits Iran with a round of sanctions. 2 IRGC commanders and 2 of the companies that are tied with those commanders were sanctioned, the U.S. alleging that they were supplying lethal drones and related materials to insurgent groups in Iraq, Lebanon, Yemen, and Ethiopia. I'm not exactly sure who they allege that these weapons are going to in Ethiopia. Obviously, Iraq, it would be the Shia militias. Yemen would be the Houthi, and Lebanon would be Hezbollah, or, like the Amal militia, some kind of Shia force there. Anyways, this seems like just a way to throw cold water on tots and won't have any major impact. A lot of this stuff was already probably sanctioned, but the Iranians have been very clear they're not going to allow any kind of perception that this is the Americans bullying the Iranians back into tots with their economic warfare, with their threats of sanctions, with, the different things that the U.S. has done across the Middle East, cyber attacks, assassinations. They're saying they're not going to allow that to be what brings them back into the deal. And so this will probably cause the Iranians to drag their feet even more and resist getting into talks with the Americans anytime soon. So, this was pretty significant and just seems to be another sign that the Biden administration are in no way interested in returning to the Iran nuclear deal and avoiding confrontation in the Middle East. We also had the Biden administration saying we had two officials, including the assistant to senior Middle East office on Biden's National Security Council, say that the U.S. has given assurances to the U.S.-backed Kurdish forces in Syria that the U.S. would not be leaving. And this is pretty significant that we're getting the confirmation, because I talked about on the show recently that we had heard this from the Kurdish forces. They go by SDF, Syrian Democrat Forces, that that they had gotten these assurances from the Biden administration. However, it's expected that the Kurds are going to say this, but now that we have this also from the Biden administration as confirmation, it's very interesting that we're going to double down and continue on this occupation of Syria. Now, the reason that this is so critical to Iran is that with the current politics in the United States and how weak Biden is, I think it's very unlikely that the U.S. is going to be able to return to the Iran nuclear deal without withdrawing from Syria. And I'll kind of explain that in a second here. Now, one other little news story here to talk about, and that is that the U.S.-backed SDF is launching a massive conscription campaign. So the side that we are backing, the occupation that we are backing in Syria, is trying to conscript a whole bunch of people to go and fight a war against Turkey, which is, of course, America's NATO ally, just to go show what a absolute mess the U.S. policy in Syria is, and how our alleged allies in Syria really aren't like the greatest upstanding people. They're just going to conscript people who have no interest in fighting their war and try to force them to fight their war against Turkey, not even worrying about the Islamic State or anything like that. We also had Israel and Syria carrying out two drone strikes. And then we had a drone hit near the U.S. base in southern Syria at Al-Tanf. And so when you look at a map of Syria, you would see that the United States occupies pretty much all the territory east of the Euphrates River, but there's also a small area, like kind of a semicircle, that's about 50 or so kilometers in radius around a border crossing with Jordan called Al-Tanf, where we have about 200 American soldiers and maybe 1,000 or so Syrian rebels from who knows what faction that the U.S. has trained and they occupy. And so somebody sent a drone in and almost hit this area. So this is why the U.S. won't be able to return, I think, to the Iran talks or any success with the Iran nuclear deal until we get out of Syria, is that anything that happens in Syria that is at all even relatively targeting Americans is going to be blamed on Iran, whether it's ISIS, whether it's Turkey, whether it's our own Syrian Kurdish allies or the Islamic State, or actually is, Shia militias, Assad, or Iranian bad forces carrying out some kind of operations against against the Americans because, first off, the U.S. is occupying Syria. Assad wants his country and territory back. And if, the U.S. shoots at anybody who comes near its base, well, then eventually the country whose base America is in may have something to say about that and shoot at the Americans that are there. This is just common sense. If you don't want the Americans shot at, get them the hell out of harm's way. Now, the other thing is that if Israel is going to keep bombing Syria, one target that Shia militias may see to apply pressure against the opposite side, the Americans and their Israeli allies, etc., would be to target the American forces that are within striking distance. And so we're essentially putting our troops in harm's way. And if Israel, like as they have, repeatedly sabotages the U.S. talks with Iran by increasing their bombing and raids in Syria, can hope to generate some kind of blowback against U.S. troops in Syria, which then American Republicans and mainstream media will blame on the Iranians, making it politically very difficult for Biden to choose to re-enter the Iran nuclear deal. I see this happening time and time again, and until Biden has the courage to leave Syria, then he's not going to be able to. I mean, he could. Obama, of course, did get into the JCPOA while the U.S. was in Syria, although at that time the Islamic State was a far larger force. I think it was probably at its peak in Syria at that time. And so, when there's a common enemy to fight over, it's maybe a little bit easier to get diplomacy done. The U.S. doesn't have the benefit of that at all right now. And, the places in Syria where the U.S. occupies is directly up against Syrian government, which is allied with Iranian territory. That's what I had on all the Iranian stuff. There was two more stories here that are, and then in response to the strikes, Biden says the U.S. Will take actions against Iran. Of course, if the U.S. takes actions against Iran, that will put more of a kibosh on any possible talks between the U.S. and the Iranians. We also have Antony Blinken, who is the Secretary of State, the man who should be most committed to trying to get diplomacy done with Iran, says the U.S. would not rule out the idea of military action on Iran. And this was on the Sunday Talk shows with CBS. So very disturbing that we have the Secretary of State saying this. He should be absolutely committed to diplomacy and, doing everything he can to move forward with this because, the U.S. can't go to war with Iran. And yet that is the path that the U.S. is walking down, largely guided by Israel. Now, there's reports in Iran of a cyber attack causing widespread disruption at gas stations. I don't think this has been officially blamed on or blame accepted by the Israelis, but it kind of does have Israel/U.S. Attack written all over it, especially with the timing, potential to return to the nuclear, talks, nuclear deal talks in Vienna and all that. A way to stop that would, of course, be to carry out a cyber attack against Iran, because Iran isn't going to engage in diplomacy when it's being attacked. The whole idea that Iran just needs to be strong-armed to the point it goes to walks to the table and gives up everything is just an absurd negotiation strategy that doesn't work with the Iranians. They're just too powerful of a force. Now, one thing I will say is maybe this was some kind of internal Iranian problem and they're just trying to blame it on Israel and the U.S. That is a possibility, but when you look at what happened, it kind of does seem like some kind of cyber attack. And then there's two things that other reasons that kind of makes it seem that way. One is that this happened just before the 2-year anniversary of some large protests in Iran that were triggered by an increase in fuel prices in Iran. And so that is, it seems like maybe something that you could get people riled up about. Also, there were reports that are unconfirmed, but was reported in Reuters and other places too, that the street signs were changed to say, Ayatollah, who has your gas, or something. Oh, Khamenei, where is your gasoline? And so if that did take place, that would also suggest that maybe this was a little bit more of a coordinated cyber attack and not just some systems failure. All right, I want to talk about the recent coup in Sudan. Now, when I talk about most of the things going on in Africa, I do like to start off with the disclaimer that I do find it very difficult to get good reporting that I really trust, and could say like, oh, this is happening, this is happening. So I try to be very careful and worded that, this source is reporting that this person who I think is on this side is saying this kind of thing, because just because it's reported in Reuters or the AP, I don't think that means it's true, it's accurate, and oftentimes these places do have their biases, but it's less easy to discern than, say, Iraq or Afghanistan, where I'm constantly reading about it and have a good, firm understanding of who everybody is. And so a coup happened. It looks like the civilian council that was set up after the previous coup, where the longtime dictator Bashir was overthrown, then I think for probably 18 months or so, there was like a military control, plus there was a popular protest that like had a civilian council, and I believe eventually there was a leader picked from that civilian council, and so that person has been displaced, and Sudan's new leader is General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan. And if I'm butchering that, very sorry, but General Abdel is now in control of Sudan. I did see that there was an unnamed Israeli official who said that this was a good thing. And so I don't know. One unnamed Israeli official could or could not be speaking for the whole Israeli government. Although I did understand in the past that this general, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, was a somebody who had at least a relationship with the Gulf Arab states and Israel, so Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Israel, and so that does kind of fit that Israel would be happy about it if that is the case. In response to the coup, the U.S. suspended the aid it gives to Sudan, $700 million, and there is this interesting report from Axios that says the new leader met with Jeffrey Feltman, who is the U.S. Special Envoy for the Horn of Africa, and they met before the coup happened, the day before the coup, and so that suggests that the U.S. was informed of this plan beforehand. Now, after the coup, the U.S. does condemn it. So I'm not exactly sure what happened in the meeting between Feltman and the Sudanese coup leader, if they were able to, like, if this was worked out and handshake, if maybe Feltman gave the coup leader a sign that he shouldn't have. I mean, we know this happened with Saddam in April Gillespie, going back to like 1990 now, I guess, when she kind of green lighted, or at least Saddam and the Iraqis took it as a green light that they could invade Kuwait without a response from the U.S., which obviously didn't work out. So it could be something like that, where just disorganization and failures within the Biden diplomat departments create a situation where a miscommunication was made and the coup was moved ahead with, even though maybe it wouldn't have been if they knew that the Americans were going to condemn it. Or it could have been that they were going to do it anyways. I have no idea. But it doesn't seem like the U.S. took any kind of action to try to prevent the coup before it happened. Not quite sure what the U.S. could have done, but it doesn't seem like anything was done. One more note here is that in the weeks leading up, or maybe a month even, leading up to this coup, the main Red Sea port of Sudan has been blockaded by what is described, and I don't know what this means, as a tribal group in the area. Beja, maybe is how it's pronounced, and that since this coup has taken place, within a week they went ahead and lifted their blockade of the port. No idea if there's any ties or connection there, but it does seem like there maybe would be. Now, also just talking about Sudan real quick, neighboring country, that's even got a larger population that is suffering quite a bit of instability right now is Ethiopia. You could go back and check out the show I did with Danny Sherjan on Ethiopia if you want more of a background. I've been looking at a lot of news that seems to be developing very fast out of Ethiopia today, where you had the leader of the country actually calling for the citizens to take up arms and defend the capital city. If that's happening, that kind of suggests to me, see, and like maybe who knows, maybe he was giving like a fiery speech, and the rhetoric's been misinterpreted or overstated, but it sounds like that the capital city may be in real trouble. There's reports that members of the TPLF, that's the Tigray People's Liberation Front, have been making a lot of gains against cities, including in territory that is not just ethnically Tigray, but also the Hamara region. And then the Ethiopian government alleges that in at least one town that Tigray forces took over, they killed 100 members of that ethnic group's youth. Not exactly sure what the definition of youth is. Could be like up to 12, could be up to 18, could be up to 21, I guess. But nonetheless, they are alleging that the TPLF are committing war crimes. I also saw that the Oromo Liberation Army was taking territory against the central government as well. Now, I understood that the leader was a member of the Oromo ethnic group, so I'm not sure exactly how this is all playing out, but it could be that, this is a group that wants its own separation and autonomy and is looking to like kind of capitalize on the current instability and take territory. But it does seem like there's a lot of fighting and instability going on right now in Ethiopia. And I'm going to try to keep up with this and maybe try to have on a guest who understands these countries a little bit more than I do. So I feel more confident that I'm not just repeating some worst day narrative or anything like that. But very interesting that these are two large, important African countries, neighboring countries that seem to be going through quite a bit of political instability right now. All right, everybody, that's the show for today. Hope you enjoy it. Please keep sharing the show and supporting the Institute. Conflicts of Interest is up everywhere you can listen to podcasts: YouTube, Rumble, Odysee, Facebook, MeWe, Twitter. Donate to the Institute, donate to the show, and buy your CBD at Paloma Verde. Thanks, everyone.